Good afternoon. Welcome students, faculty, staff, and friends of the college. My name is Matt Bell, and I'm the Executive Director of Programs for External Affairs here at the college. My wife is 39 weeks and 5 days pregnant. Bad timing, I know. I mention that only because if for some reason I'm suddenly gone, you'll know that it's likely I wasn't fired or killed. My wife would also like to remind you guys, as she reminds me every single day, that mothers are pregnant for 10 months, not 9. Sorry, my Microsoft sensitivity editor wants me to redo that sentence. My partner would like me to remind you persons, as they remind me every single day, that birthing people carry non-binary offspring for 10 months, not 9. That's better. In fact, this nonsensical twisting of our language has everything to do with this seminar on the Inklings, who were masters of the English language. While the meaning of words changes over time, broad agreement about the meaning of foundational words such as man, woman, nature, marriage, good, evil, father, and mother existed in the world of the Inklings, but they saw great cracks emerging. In an essay titled "The Death of Words," C.S. Lewis writes, "Words, as well as women, can be killed with kindness. And when, however reverently, you have killed a word, you have also blotted from the human mind the thing that the word originally stood for. Men do not long continue to think what they have forgotten how to say." On education, Lewis was clear that the new progressive models of education of his day were detrimental. He paints a picture of one such model in the Narnia books with Eustace Scrubb and Jill Poll's school, Experiment House, of which he wrote that those who ran the school had scrambled minds and believed that boys and girls should be allowed to do what they like, that Bibles were not encouraged there, and that neither Eustace nor Jill knew anything about being a son of Adam or a daughter of Eve, because neither were taught who Adam and Eve were. In his Abolition of Man, Lewis gives the antidote to poor education, writing, "The task of the modern educator is not to cut down jungles, but to irrigate deserts. The right defense against false sentiments is to inculcate just sentiments. On politics, we read from J.R.R. Tolkien in The Lord of the Rings, a sentiment eerily familiar to us today, spoken by one with power, the wizard Saruman. He writes, "Saruman drew himself up and then began to declaim, as if he were making a speech long and rehearsed. The elder days are gone, the middle days are passing, the younger days are beginning. The time of the elves is over, but our time is at hand. The world of men which we must rule. But we must have power to do all things as we will, for that good which only the wise can see." Today's Saruman might say, "I represent science." With science, the few wise, as they see themselves, seek to rule everything in society. Indeed, they seek to remake society, to abolish human freedom, religion, the family, and even human nature itself. Again, turning to the Abolition of Man, Lewis writes, "Man's conquest over nature, if the dreams of some scientific planners are realized, means the rule of a few hundreds of men over billions upon billions of men. There neither is nor can be any simple increase of man's power on man's side. Each new power won by man is a power over man as well. The final stage has come when man has obtained full control over himself. Human nature will be the last part of nature to surrender to man. For the power of man to make himself what he pleases, as we have seen, is the power of some men to make other men what they please. We can see this happening today right before our eyes, and we must provide a clear and powerful alternative to this evil. So we gather this week and dedicate ourselves to learning of the Inklings, so that we may be able to defend and in many cases restore language, education, and politics with a true understanding of human nature and above all, an understanding of the heavens and of God. We will find and gain a deeper knowledge of this understanding in their great works of literature. We have a fun week ahead of us. The student who will introduce our speaker this afternoon is Emma Purdy, who is a junior from Ann Arbor, Michigan, though we don't hold that against her, and she's majoring in psychology. Please welcome Emma to the podium.
Bradley J. Berzer is a Russell Amos Kirk Professor in American Studies at Hillsdale College. He earned his BA at the University of Notre Dame and his MA and PhD at Indiana University. A fellow at the Reagan Presidential Library, he is a former visiting scholar of conservative thought, Colorado University Boulder, and a board member of Free Enterprise Institute and the Center for Cultural Renewal. His writings have appeared in several publications, including The Imaginative Conservative, a site which he co-founded, and Ignatius Insight and Catholic World Report. He is the author of several books, including Sanctifying the World, The Augustinian Life, and Mind of Christopher Dawson, J.R.R. Tolkien's Sanctifying Myth in Defense of Andrew Jackson, and forthcoming, Tolkien and the Inklings, Men of the West. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bradley J. Berzer.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is fantastic to be here. I'm so honored that the CCA office asked me to speak, and thank you to Emma for that very nice introduction. So I do want to thank a number of people before I get started. My wife, right here, and my son Nathaniel, both of them listened to me actually give this talk last night. So here they are again, which is cruel and unusual punishment for a father to inflict upon his family. But I do want to thank them. And I want to thank Matt Bell and Doug Jeffrey and Tim Kaspar and everyone at the CCA office for inviting me. And it's great to have Hillsdale faculty be a part of this, and I'm very honored to do this. I also want to thank Dr. Mark Kaltoff. I don't know where he is right now. There he is, over there. I want to thank him. He didn't actually do anything, but he's the dean of faculty, and it feels like it should be one of those things that he is thanked for. And he's actually leading the faculty panel on Wednesday. So I'm thankful for the faculty panel as well, my colleagues. It's great. And I don't know if you can see, but over here is the gauntlet of other speakers, which is, I mean, they're actually all sitting together over there. And they all know each other, and it's a little intimidating. So if I don't look over there during the speech, you'll know why. They frighten me. Okay, so I'm going to do something I don't normally do, and I know most of you don't know me, but I generally like to speak spontaneously, but there's so much that I want to get into this speech. Who are the Inklings? That I'm going to actually read a paper and then kind of talk in between reading that paper. So I hope that my voice is not a soporific. I hope nobody falls asleep, especially as we're thinking about dinner and waiting for dinner and contemplating dinner and other things. Tollers, C.S. Lewis declared, using one of the many names, nicked and otherwise, of his good friend John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. There is too little of what we like in stories, and I'm afraid we shall have to try and write some ourselves. Though Tolkien did not record the exact date of this conversation, it almost certainly happened sometime in the mid-1930s, probably around 1936. Tolkien had already written but had not published The Hobbit, and he would soon write his most famous academic essays on Beowulf and on fairy stories. He held the chair at Oxford of Pembroke College, soon to be followed by an even more prestigious chair, the Merton Chair at Merton College at Oxford. Lewis, however, held the much less prestigious position of Fellow at Magdalen College, Oxford, but his writing career was nearly at the same stage of Tolkien's, if not just a little bit higher. By the mid-1930s, he had written his first significant piece of scholarship, A Note on Comus, as well as his excellent Allegory of Love. But after his conversion to Christianity in September and October of 1931, he had begun to write Christian apologetics in a variety of forms. The first significant such book was his Pilgrim's Regress, after which his great friend Owen Barfield, and also a sometime Inkling, said, "Lewis never looked back, but appeared to my dazzled eyes to go on and on for the rest of his life, writing more and more successful books at shorter and shorter intervals." But would it be possible, Tolkien and Lewis wondered in this probably 1936 conversation, to write fiction that might combine all of these things: a love of history, a desire to debate the defenders of the modern West, and to point out the many foibles of modern living, and a way to promote one's philosophical and religious beliefs without being overly blatant? That is, could a modern writer create art while avoiding the pitfalls of the ever-prevalent ideological morass and political propaganda of the era and remain artful? After a toss-up, and this is all we know, they had a toss-up, whether that's just a way of describing an agreement or if they actually tossed a coin, the two men agreed that Lewis's stories would deal with space travel, while Tolkien's would deal with time travel. It should be remembered, and I want to stress this in my talk, that the term science fiction did not yet exist in the 1930s, except by a very few pockets of followers here and there, and would not become the accepted term of that genre until about 1952. While other writers such as Sir Thomas More, Mark Twain, G.K. Chesterton, H.G. Wells, and Aldous Huxley had already employed what would one day be called and labeled science fiction, Tolkien and Lewis's decision to write of such things was absolutely out of the ordinary in the 1930s. So much so that the average person in the English-speaking world regarded what would be known as science fiction, and again, this is so prevalent today. We lock into the Barnes & Noble, into the youth section, and all we see is science fiction and dystopia. But this was not the case in the 1930s, when most people thought of science fiction, if they thought of it at all, as something kind of juvenile and pornographic at the same time. It was merely the stuff of pulp fiction. What Tolkien and Lewis were really hoping to create through their science fiction, and what they succeeded in doing, was creating myth and fairy stories. Lewis's books that came from this friendly competition, Out of the Silent Planet, Perelandra, and That Hideous Strength, became immediately successful and propelled Lewis into the public eye in the United Kingdom as well as in North America, and helped legitimize science fiction. I would go so far as to state that C.S. Lewis on that side of the Atlantic and Ray Bradbury on this side of the Atlantic absolutely legitimized this form of science fiction and made it respectable. Tolkien's attempt at a time travel story failed in the short term, though, and it would take 2 more decades for The Lord of the Rings to appear in print, and another 2 decades after that for the Silmarillion to be published. And in the 4 decades since the Silmarillion first appeared, at least 15 more volumes of Tolkien's imaginary world of Middle-earth have been edited and published by his now late son, Christopher. Additionally, it seems, the two decided to allow each other free rein to create as he would. Inspired by the fear that space travel would allow men to ignore sin and believe that technology could triumph over all in the universe, Lewis decided to write his story as a cautionary tale against imperialism, while also including rather traditional Christian theology, incorporating and baptizing pagan mythology as well. By the third of the trilogy, That Hideous Strength, Lewis had borrowed significantly from Tolkien's own invented Atlantean world of Numenor. But Numenor, corrupted as Numenor, different spellings, appears 9 times in That Hideous Strength, as well as in one of C.S. Lewis's poems, The End of the Wine, and very likely as the background to Atlantis in the Narnian tale, The Magician's Nephew. But I'll leave that up to Father Ward to explain. Not surprisingly, especially given Tolkien's rather eccentric as well as individualistic character, he was plotting, and he took nothing from Lewis except the inspiration to work and to keep his fortitude as stoically as possible. Completely unrelated to anything Lewis wrote or created, Tolkien's own time travel story became intimately a part of his larger mythology, his legendarium, incorporated as the touchstone of the second age of Middle-earth, a world in which men rose and fell. But in almost every way, this one challenge between Lewis and Tolkien fits the friendship as well as the personalities of each rather perfectly. Tolkien niggled. He was a perfectionist seeking nothing less than the good, the true, and the beautiful. But Lewis was a bolt of lightning. He was a force of nature. He never stopped, as though his mind and his soul were incapable of true rest. Whereas That Hideous Strength is one of the finest, if not the finest, dystopian novels of the 20th century, it flawlessly captures the fears and delusions of both right-wing and left-wing progressivism in the 1940s. But in grand contrast, The Lord of the Rings, published a decade later, reveals and explores the very essence of what it means to be human, even though it's about hobbits and elves and dwarves. If That Hideous Strength, again, probably Lewis's greatest work, along with his Abolition of Man, was the Christian 1984 of its time, The Lord of the Rings might be, as I would say, the greatest tale of modernity, comparable, and I realize that I'm being rather dramatic here, but I do believe this to be the case, comparable to Virgil's The Aeneid, the great tale of the ancient world, and Dante's Divine Comedy, the great tale of the medieval world. I would go so far as to say that 500 years from now, people will look back at Tolkien's mythology in the same way that we look back to Dante or to Virgil or to Homer. And yet, whatever their own differences in personality, in religious outlook, and in artistic achievement, Tolkien and Lewis cannot be separated one from another. The two belong together as readily as Lewis and Clark, as surely as Holmes and Watson, and as wonderfully as Batman and Robin. Their friendship, quite real, was nothing less than one of the greatest friendships of the 20th century. Where the two men gathered, other men coalesced, they changed, and they became something greater than what they had been alone as individuals, no matter what level or type of genius each possessed. Through their friendship, and especially in its most important manifestation, the Inklings, Tolkien and Lewis created what their mutual friend, Owen Barfield, called a commonwealth of the spirit in which there is no copyright. Let me repeat that. I love that idea of what friendship is. It's a commonwealth of the spirit in which there is no copyright. Yet whatever love and admiration Tolkien and Lewis shared for one another, and the never-ending inspiration one gave to the other, the two often found themselves out of sync with one another. Lewis, again, that force of nature, stated things too quickly, borrowed from others too readily, and rarely cared what another thought of him. Whereas Tolkien, that gentleman of wisdom, moved slowly, observed everything, desired originality to a fault, and worried constantly about what he said and what others said. Nothing is so revelatory of their personalities as the way Oxford thought of each and they of Oxford. Most students admired both Tolkien and Lewis, but they adored Tolkien as fatherly and grandfatherly, while they feared and simultaneously admired Lewis as a bulldog, sometimes odd and sometimes rabid in his criticisms. Almost a fop, Tolkien appeared everywhere and anywhere with handsome dignity. But a bachelor throughout most of his life, Lewis considered it unmanly and vain to care about his appearance. He reeked of various types of tobacco. It's actually quite stunning how much he smoked. And his wardrobe clothed him rather shabbily. When it came to their equals and academic peers, however, Lewis possessed the thick skin of a dragon's hide, while Tolkien allowed every comment to become a slight, accumulating them as if a type of a death by 1,000 cuts. And yet, what a friendship. Each loved mythology, honesty, and God. Each desired to make the world a better place, and each knew the other as a vital ally in making all of this happen. Most importantly, the two men loved and admired one another, whatever their specific troubles might hang over them, real or imagined. Certainly, each thought the other a genius and a rarity in this world of sorrows. The two first met at a faculty meeting, of all things, on May 11th of 1926. Lewis famously wrote in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy, that as a Protestant Ulsterman, he had been taught all of his life never to trust a papist or a philologist. Tolkien, Lewis notes rather humorously, was both. A year later, in 1927, Tolkien founded the Coalbiters, a group dedicated to learning Icelandic, that is Old Norse, and reading the great sagas and Eddas of the Northern Middle Ages, seeing them as a means to promote a very particular understanding of Anglo-Saxon language, history, and culture. On October 17th of 1929, the friendship of the two men became something more than academic and more than just two who admired one another. For on this day, Tolkien and Lewis admitted that they had an almost childlike love of all things northern. Mythologically, they loved the gods, they loved the giants, and they loved Asgard. And they ended up talking for almost 3 hours that night about all such things. And even more importantly, this conversation led to Tolkien admitting that he had been working on his own mythological world for over a decade. Again, his legendarium, as he called it. This had been little more than a private hobby with only a few published poetic manifestations up to this point in Tolkien's life. And only his closest friends and family knew anything about this. He even that night lent a copy of one of his lays, his poetic myths, to Lewis, following this meaningful conversation. 2 months later, Lewis offered Tolkien the following response. I sat up late last night and have read your story as far as where Beren and his elvish allies defeat the patrol of orcs above the sources of the Narog and then disguise themselves in the reef. I can quite honestly say it has been ages since I have had an evening of such delight. As Lewis did to and for so many of his friends, he bolstered Tolkien's creative spirit and tenacity. He challenged him to do better and to perfect what already seemed to be perfect. Tolkien also continued to talk with Lewis about religion and myth in particular, especially Christianity, trying to wean his friend of his quasi-atheistic views. On the evening of September 18th and into the early morning of September 19th of 1931, Tolkien, another friend, Hugo Dyson, and Lewis talked about the relationship of pagan mythology to Christian theology. That conversation, more than anything else in his life, convinced C.S. Lewis to become a full-blown Christian. We began, Lewis noted, on metaphor and myth, interrupted by a rush of wind which came so suddenly on the still, warm evening and sent so many leaves pattering down that we thought it was raining. We held our breath, the others appreciating the ecstasy of such a thing. His convictions became so strongly evangelical from this moment until the end of his days that it almost completely pervaded and overwhelmed his already boisterous personality. In some way that only God can understand, Lewis became not just Christian that night, but fully C.S. Lewis. 2 years after Lewis converted to Christianity in the summer of 1933, the remnants of the group that had started as the Coal-Biters had expanded or mutated, depending on one's perspective, to include many of Lewis's closest friends, and they began to call themselves the Inklings. This group of friends would have come into existence no matter its name, Tolkien claimed, as Lewis had a profound love of all things that the Inklings would come to do so well. Lewis especially, according to Tolkien, had a passion for things being read aloud, and a power of memory for things received in this way, and a facility in extemporaneous criticism, none of which were shared, especially not the last, in anything like the same degree by his friends. Interestingly, though, Lewis did not employ the term Inklings in print, at least as far as we know from his letters, until his first personal letter to Charles Williams, who would become an Inkling, but this letter was dated about 3 years before Williams became an Inkling, March 11th of 1936. 4 years later, however, Lewis dedicated his 1940 theological tract, The Problem of Pain, to the Inklings. Now, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, and this is something that I'm sure the other speakers will talk about throughout the week, but by the fall of 1949, so we really start about 1931 and we go up to the fall of 1949, by whatever measure, the Inklings had played itself out as a specific, albeit always fluid group. When October 27th, 1949, and again, remember, I'm jumping here quite a bit, 1931 to 1949, not a single person showed up for the Thursday evening meetings. The group had effectively ended by that point, even though they continued to meet in the pub on Tuesday afternoons. But over the years, from roughly 1931 to 1949, this group met on a very regular basis. Tolkien and Lewis would meet for drinks every Monday morning, and I find that astounding. It was before the first class that they taught, usually at noon, and I'm not exaggerating. They actually had 3 pints of beer generally on Monday. I can't even imagine what I would be like in class if I did something like that. Nor would I want my dean of faculty, or where's my other dean, Paul Marino, in here? I would hate to know what they would think of me after 3 beers in my first class. But these guys would then meet on Tuesday mornings, Tuesday afternoons at the Oxford pub, the Eagle and the Child, also known as the Bird and the Baby. And then again on Thursday evenings in C.S. Lewis's rooms at Oxford. Now, just imagine that for a moment. We don't know how many times they met, but if they met between 1931 and 1949, twice a week during the school years, that's an outrageous number of times that these men were together. It's wonderful, but really incredible, beyond, I think, imagination. But the Inklings first appeared in print, though not by that name, in Chad Walsh's 1949 biography and analysis, C.S. Lewis, Apostle to the Skeptics. The stretch of time from 11 to 1 on Tuesday mornings, he recorded, Lewis ordinarily manages to keep free so that he can join a small circle of close friends at a small, certain, sedate pub. There in a private parlor, he and the half a dozen others pass an hour or two conversing on everything from the nature of God to the latest university events. This particular group dates back to the war years when the Oxford University Press, whose headquarters are normally in London, fled from the Blitz to Oxford, and one of its staff, Charles Williams, became the center of a little circle. That's debatable whether he was really the center, but certainly something we can talk about this week. Became the center of a little circle which met Tuesday mornings at the pub and Thursday evenings in Lewis's college rooms. Charles Williams died in 1945. He was only 58. It was unexpected. But the Tuesday morning meetings continue. The group is a fluctuating one. It is likely to contain a couple of C.S. Lewis's colleagues, such as Professor Tolkien, 1 or 2 of his students, sometimes a relative or sometimes a distant friend. The sheer scope of these meetings astonished Walsh in hindsight. Only in retrospect, he wrote, did I realize how much intellectual ground was covered in these seemingly casual meetings. At the time, the constant bustle of Lewis racing his friends to refill their empty mugs or pausing to light another cigarette and occasionally a pipe camouflaged the steady flow of ideas. The flow, I might add, is not a one-way traffic. Lewis is as good a listener as he is a talker. In 1947, Lewis described the Inklings as a group of literary friends. We smoked, we talked, we argued, and we drank together. John Wayne, yes, that's actually his name, but it's spelled W-A-I-N, a student member of the Inklings, described the group in a similar manner. Wayne wrote that the Inklings were a circle of investigators, almost of incendiaries, meeting to urge one another on in the task of redirecting the whole current of contemporary life and art. Further, Wayne argued, C.S. Lewis, whom he labeled a dramatic personality, led this group as a pro-Christian political cell. Now, I have to note right now, and this is something, again, I think probably needs to be brought up several times during this week, Lewis adamantly disagreed with this description of what the Inklings were, but we'll get back to that. Warney, C.S. Lewis's older brother, remembered the meetings as well. Properly speaking, he wrote, the Inklings was neither a club nor a literary society, but partook of the nature of both. There were no rules, there were no officers, there was no agenda, and there were no formal elections, unless one accepts as a rule the fact that we met in Jack's rooms every Thursday evening after dinner. Proceeding neither began nor terminated at a fixed hour, though there was a tacit agreement that 10:30 was as late as one could decently arrive. From time to time, we added to our original number, but without formalities. Someone would suggest that Jones, just a name, be asked to come in on a Thursday, and either there would be a general agreement, or if the suggestion was received with a certain lack of enthusiasm, the matter was entirely dropped. But it was rarely that a name was put forward that was not generally accepted, for all of us, like Jack himself, knew the sort of man we wanted and did not want. The ritual of an Inklings was unvarying. When half a dozen or so had arrived, tea would be produced, after which, when pipes were lit, Jack would say, well, has nobody got anything to read us? Out would come a manuscript, and we would settle down to sit in judgment upon it. Real, unbiased judgment. For about the Inklings, there was nothing of a mutual admiration society. With us, praise for good work was unstinted, but censure for bad or even moderate work was brutally frank. To read to the Inklings was a formidable ordeal, and I can still remember the fear and trembling with which I offered the first chapter of my first book, and remember, too, the delight at its reception. So, to be sure, the Inklings were not a mutual admiration society. Somewhat infamously, once when Tolkien pulled out a new chapter of The Lord of the Rings, another Inkling gasped, "Oh, fudge, not another elf." Except he didn't say fudge. So, let's ask this question. Just how important was Lewis to this group? Well, no one could or should rightly deny the extraordinary influence of Lewis's personality and charisma on the Inklings, stating, as Humphrey Carpenter said in his late 1970s biography of the Inklings, without Lewis's influence, the Inklings would not have been, is too simplistic. There are two other factors, I would argue, and a whole host of smaller ones we won't get into this talk, but the two in particular, though not necessarily in importance, I would say first was the publication of Owen Barfield's 1928 work, Poetic Diction. Written originally as a thesis to earn his B.Lit., Barfield's book exerted a profound influence on the Inklings as a whole. In it, Barfield followed Plato's ideal of divine madness, arguing that not only did the imagination allow one to understand his physical sense data, but also that men do not invent mysterious relations between separate external objects and between objects and feelings. This is the function of poetry to reveal. Instead, as Barfield continued, and this is an excellent book, by the way, though a very difficult one, these relations exist independently, not indeed of thought, but of any individual thinker. Barfield explained, men in the development of consciousness have lost the power to see one as one, and our sophistication, like Odin's, has cost us an eye. And now it is only the language of poets, insofar as they create true metaphors, which can restore this unity conceptually, after it has been lost from our perception. Thus, the before unapprehended relationships of which Shelley once spoke are in a sense forgotten relationships. For though they were never yet apprehended, they were at one time seen, and imagination can see them again. Barfield, to put it simply, held that the poet holds one of the most important offices in Western civilization. Without the development of poetry and the recognition of the necessity of the poet, the Western world could easily become lost in its scientific nominalism, its pragmatism, and the organic unity of the West could easily be lost, perhaps permanently. Brilliantly argued, Barfield's Poetic Diction falls neatly into a category of a work of a number of important Christian authors in the 1920s, related to works by Nicholas Berdyaev, T.S. Eliot, Christopher Dawson, and Paul Emer Moore. But as mentioned above, the influence of Barfield's thought and works upon the various members of the Inklings cannot be exaggerated. In many ways, Poetic Diction set the tone for the group as a whole, especially as they saw themselves, again, as John Wayne, that student, put it, redirecting the whole current of contemporary life and art. And through myth and metaphor and poetry, these would lead a revival of Western civilization. Tolkien, of all of the Inklings, may have been the most profoundly influenced by this book, though he had already arrived at many of the same conclusions as Barfield did in Poetic Diction. But they allowed Tolkien to order and shape his own not fully formed thoughts when he read the book. In a letter to Barfield, Lewis wrote, "You might like to know that when Tolkien dined with me the other night, he said apropos of something quite different, that your conception of the ancient semantic unity had modified his whole outlook, and that he was always just going to say something in a lecture when your conception stopped him just in time." Barfield held a strong affinity for Tolkien's notions of mythology as well, though he didn't think that much of The Lord of the Rings. And though the atheist Lewis of the 1920s had fought vehemently against Barfield's Platonic metaphysical ideals, As a Christian, Lewis embraced them, at least in part. And one can readily see the influence of Barfield, especially poetic diction, in Lewis's space trilogy, but most particularly on the first one, Out of the Silent Planet. But the other major influence, so I'm listing the three influences, is Lewis's personality, and then Barfield's poetic diction, and the third one, Tolkien's legendarium, also matters. Tolkien first presented his minor manifestations of his entire huge mythology, which begins about 1913 and to this day has not been entirely published. That is, The Hobbit, written in the early to mid-1930s, and The Lord of the Rings, written between 1938 and 1949, to the Inklings. He read these aloud, chapter by chapter. And while each of these things may individually be merely temporal coincidences, the coincidences collectively are too strong to be dismissed. Tolkien met Lewis when he had completed the first major outline of the Silmarillion. They served as members of the Coalbiders, which evolved for the most part into the Inklings, and the Inklings met until 1949, the same year that Tolkien completed The Lord of the Rings. Indeed, Tolkien's mythology, I would argue, served as both a backdrop and a centerpiece for the Inklings themselves. Still, there were a number of other figures and other members of this fluid group, and they should not be dismissed or discounted. C.S. Lewis's brother, I've already mentioned Warney, the great historian, the romantic theologian Charles Williams, the biographer Lord David Cecil, the Royal Naval Officer Jim Dundas Grant, ancient historian C.E. Stevens, the Dominican priest and scholar of Byzantium, Matthew Gervais, classicist Colin Hardy, literary scholar Hugo Dyson, physician Robert Havard, historian and political theorist R.B. McCallum, literary scholar Neville Coghill, Anglo-Saxonist C.L. Wren, and poet and theologian Adam Fox. Not a bad list by any means. Sometimes students would attend the Inklings as well, though their role is unclear in the larger history of the group itself. Regardless, each student who attended offers a fascinating take on what he saw and what it might have meant. These included Tolkien's son, Christopher Tolkien, J.A.W. Bennett, George Sayers, Roger Lancelyn Green, and John Wayne. And because Dorothy Sayers contributed to the memorial volume written for Charles Williams, some commentators have suggested that she too was an Inkling, but this is taking it too far. The Inklings remained strictly male during the entirety of their existence. Again, though, it is critical to remember that the meeting times as well as the membership of the Inklings were always and ever fluid. The group of friends never pretended to be a formal club, and it never desired to exist as a sort of ideological cell, as Lewis cautioned. Shortly before his death, Lewis wrote, "The whole picture of myself as forming a cabinet or a cell or a coven," remember what John Wayne had said, "is erroneous. To claim such a thing," Lewis noted with adamancy, "is to mistake purely personal relationships for alliances." And so I would ask us, as we're thinking about trying to understand the Inklings, that we have to think apolitically and non-ideologically. One should not see them as promoting any specific man-made ideal or political or cultural or economic or social system. And yet, having claimed this, I think there are a number of things, and I'll offer four, there are a number of things that we can say about the Inklings as a whole. First, the Inklings saw themselves specifically as bardic defenders of Western civilization. One only has to think of the numerous passages from The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion, all of which praise the best of the West, while never failing to recognizing its many sins and sinful longings. And especially in Lewis's space trilogy and That Hideous Strength, he has this whole discussion between two of the main characters, Arthur Ransom and then Merlin, an actual resurrected Merlin from the past, where the two discuss the very failings of the West and how the West might be saved. The Inklings as a whole remained quite patriotic while also recognizing that true patriotism, especially when it comes to Western civilization, demands critique, restraint, and self-censorship. The profound Anglo-Welsh man of letters, Christopher Dawson, remarked in his own Gifford lectures in the late 1940s that the bard, by whatever title, and when I say bard, it's B-A-R-D, right, stood at the very center of every community, culture, and civilization. The bard speaks with the voice of the divine through the poetic and the prophetic, thus acting as an intermediary and a bridge between a god and his worshipers. When absent, so too is its representative culture or civilization. There is, of course, something deeply mystical and anti-rationalist in this belief of the ideal. It has the feel of Socrates and Plato all over it. Yet far from arrogant in its meaning, such a belief about a bard being the center of culture is as deeply humbling as it is burdensome. For only through story can a community understand itself, inherit its just rewards, and pass on its wisdom to the next generation, hoping against all odds that the future will embrace and transmit that same idea on and on. To break the chain serves as the height of arrogance and presumption, whether by an individual, a community, or a generation. This is what Barfield and then C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery. Here, then, one might readily see the Inklings as members of a poetic as well as of a prophetic community. There are equal parts Plato and Jeremiah in the group, and one finds these throughout their works, whether we're looking at the fiction of Tolkien and Lewis or at the biographies of Lord David Cecil. They are thorough, they are wide, and they are deep in their discussions of things such as dreaming, of poetry, of imagination, of visions, and of mystical experiences. Lewis and Tolkien each believed in personal forms of mystical experiences, especially Tolkien, but they also imbued their own fictional characters with these same attributes. The physical senses matter, to be certain, but the soul and the imagination matter even more. Each considered beauty, properly understood, to be the contextualization of hope. And beyond this, the bard must touch upon the meaning of heroism, the meaning of beauty, the meaning of holiness, and the meaning of sanctity, while never forgetting the more mundane things such as style and context and presentation. The bard expresses all of these longings with whatever gifts have been given him and to the community, whether that community possesses the ears, the will, or the integrity to hear and understand or not. One might readily think of Aragorn telling the tale of Beren and Luthien only moments before the Ringwraith's attack at Weathertop. Still a stranger to his companions at this point in the story, Aragorn serves here as the bard, and his tale has as much in common with prayer as it does with mere tale-telling. Indeed, one cannot even imagine The Lord of the Rings absent its myriad of songs. For each song connects the singer to something historical and significant, binding together not only the immediate group, but tying that group to something larger. Even the seemingly homely songs of Sam bind the company to the hearth and home of the Shire. Second, the various Inklings took seriously the ideas and realities of friendship as a necessary bulwark to the dread conformity of the modern world. Here again, I think it's absolutely essential that we think in pre-ideological or a-ideological terms. For a true friendship, as Lewis and Tolkien understood by its very nature, is not only exclusive, but it is non-political. That outlook, which values the collective above the individual, necessarily disparages friendship, Lewis wrote. It is a relationship between men at their highest level of individuality. It withdraws men from collective togetherness as surely as solitude itself could do, and more dangerously, for it withdraws them from society by twos and threes. Yet we must not think of the crowd and then the Inklings either. Instead, as Lewis and Tolkien understood, a free and properly functioning world means that millions upon millions of communities exist, some overlapping, some not. An individual person belongs not just to one such community at any given time in his or her life, but rather to many simultaneously. Time and circumstance, as much as personal desire and loyalty, shape the time and treasure a person gives to each association to which he belongs. And whatever opposition the world offers, friendship is always worth it. Throughout Tolkien's academic as well as his fictional writings, he stressed again and again the necessity of friendship and community. In some of his earliest tales, not surprisingly, Tolkien would begin his stories in a hall or a room with all of the characters seated around a fire. That fire warmed the hearts of the bards as well as the audience, and he always called these the Tale, T-A-L-E, fires. A similar place exists in the home of Elrond in both The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And on a much more personal level, Tolkien had always belonged to some group of friends that had dedicated itself to a mission or a calling. Prior to the First World War, Tolkien had experienced an incredible and meaningful friendship with three others in his school, King Edward's: Christopher Wiseman, Jeffrey Smith, and Rob Gilson. The best of friends, they had called themselves the TCBS. They stayed close to one another after graduating, and they held councils with one another in which they would share their poetry and their ideas. Gilson died on July 1st of 1916 at the Somme. Shaken, Tolkien had written that the three remaining had a duty to achieve greatness, not for personal glory, but for God's glory. They were to be great instruments in God's hands. Just as Gilson had achieved greatness through his sacrifice for something greater than himself, so the three remaining friends must, quote, be steeped with the same holiness of courage, suffering, and sacrifice. Indeed, Tolkien went so far as to call July 1st, the day on which Gilson died, a holy day to be remembered for the rest of their lives. So he wrote to Smith on August 12th. And sometime in the week before Christmas of that same year, Tolkien received a letter from Christopher Wiseman, one of the four. German shrapnel had taken the life of Smith. Now only two remained. Of course, the TCBS must be all that we dreamt, and its work in the end to be done by two or three or one survivor, and the part of the others must be trusted by God to that of the inspiration, which we do know we all got and we get from one another. Lewis, too, wrote openly about the necessity of friendship and exclusion. Friendship is the greatest of worldly goods, he wrote in a private letter. Certainly to me, it is the chief happiness of life. If I had to give a piece of advice to a young man about a place to live, I think I should say to him, sacrifice almost everything to live where you can be near your friends. Third, the Inklings were extraordinary at making good good. They did this through myth. We may indeed be older now, Tolkien wrote in 1939, insofar as we are heirs in enjoyment or in practice of many generations of the ancestors of the arts. In this inheritance of wealth, there may be a danger of boredom or of anxiety to be original, and that may lead to a distaste for fine drawing, delicate pattern, and pretty colors, or else to a mere manipulation and over-elaboration of old material, clever and heartless. This is what he said at the University of St. Andrews in the late 1930s. But, he said, we should look at green again and be startled anew, but not blinded by blue and yellow and red. We should meet the centaur and the dragon, and then perhaps suddenly behold, like the ancient shepherds, sheep and dogs and horses and wolves. One can also think of Tolkien's description of Gandalf in the Silmarillion. Known as Olorin in the True West, he had been the least of the Istari, of the wizards, to be sent to Middle-earth to aid men and elves in their battle against Sauron. Though the least powerful, though, he was the wisest, and he spent his days in the Elder Times walking among the elves, quote, unseen or in a form as one of them. And the elves did not know whence came the fair visions or the promptings of wisdom that he put into their hearts. The Silmarillion records that those who listened to Olorin, to Gandalf, awoke from despair and put away their imaginations of darkness. Lucifer, obviously a slip. Lewis also admired the art of escape through poetry, literature, and imagination. Again, I can't stress enough how radical it was that he employed science fiction as a genre. The fantastic or mythical is a mode available at all ages for some readers, for others at none, he wrote. But at all ages, if it is well used by the author and meets the right reader, it has the same power, Lewis wrote for the New York Times in 1956. It has the power to generalize while remaining concrete, to present in palpable form not concepts or even experiences, but whole classes of experiences, and to throw off irrelevancies. In its best form, the fantastic adds to life. It doesn't just comment on it. And this should take us back again to Owen Barfield's poetic diction in 1928, where he said, "A civilization must look more and more to art, to the individualized poet as the very source and fountainhead of all meaning." In a 1984 interview, Barfield nicely summed up the thinking of Lewis and Tolkien on literature and on art, where he said, "All felt that literature shouldn't be used as a means of propagating a message. The thing that mattered was that it was a good work of art and that had its own value, which in the long run is a Christian value." I think that there should perhaps be a fair way, as I imagine, of stating both Lewis and Tolkien's view. And finally, fourth, Tolkien and Lewis and the Inklings as a whole viewed themselves as a group defending as a final, noble, and romantic defense the Old West. Lewis, in his Cambridge inaugural address in 1954, described himself as an old Western man, a dinosaur who needed to be studied because he represented something that was long gone. Clyde Kilby, who wrote about Lewis, also worked closely with Tolkien on the Silmarillion during the summer of 1966, explained, "Like Lewis, Tolkien was an old Western man who was staggered at the present direction of civilization. Even our much vaunted talk of equality he felt debased our attempts to mechanize and formalize it. Equality he believed to be primarily spiritual and not simply a moral affair. Like Lewis, he regarded any evolutionary change as downward, not upward." So, let me conclude. What does all of this mean? It means that as we try and figure out and understand the Inklings, again, I would stress, we must do so in non-ideological terms, but rather in poetic and romantic terms. It was the last stance of the last survivor that always attracted Lewis, said J.A.W. Bennett, one of the youngest Inklings. It is one of the likings that Lewis shared with William Morris, and it drew him to the sagas and the doomed Edaic gods. So whether it was through epic fantasy, science fiction, philosophy, or biography, the Inklings stood as a little platoon defending what would soon be lost utterly and completely in this world, or so they imagined. But the effort, no matter the cost or the result, remained the everlasting goal. Should fame or acknowledgement come to any or all of them, this was certainly fine, but it was fine only if it promoted the whole and the message of the whole. I don't think Lewis or I were much worried about the possibility of not becoming great men, Barfield recalled in an interview given 10 years after Lewis's death. They had their duty. They would fulfill that duty no matter the cost, and no matter how many or how few voices listened to them. As Tolkien put it, we were fighting the long defeat. So to conclude, let me note that in a Platonic sense, the Inklings might very well have brought about an anamnesis, that is, a Platonic understanding of a remembering of all that has been lost but should not have been. They may have been preservers of timeless wisdom for ages to come, so far as a future that they found unimaginable or perhaps imaginable. Through their efforts, they might bring some back to first principles, reforming what had gone terribly wrong in Western civilization. As the Inklings knew very well, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle came at the end and the aftermath of a fallen classical Athens. Cicero and Cato the Younger appeared at the end of a fallen Roman Republic, and St. Augustine at the end of the Roman Empire, and Dante at the end of the medieval. Each of these profound Western men came at a moment in which they could imagine, ideally, what had come before, but allowed them to pray that somehow, in the future, someone would remember exactly what had been lost in their own day and age. I believe this is absolutely true of the Inklings. Thank you.
Dr. Berzer has agreed to sign copies of his book, Sanctifying Myth, Understanding Middle-earth, after the lecture in the Searle lobby. We now have time for some Q&A. If you have a question, please make your way to a microphone. Student questions will be given preference.
Hello. Thank you for your talk. You said that the Inklings were defending this idea of the Old West that has been long lost and shouldn't have been. Do you think that the Old West has been lost, or do you think like that Tolkien and Lewis and their contemporaries have saved a little of it in ways that, like, for instance, institutions like Hillsdale College can still
Right.
appreciate the actual meaning of The Lord of the Rings and
Sure.
all of Lewis's works?
Yeah. Is that, I can't see very well. Is that Emily? Yes, good to see you. Good. Yeah, thank you, former student. So it's an excellent question, and it is fascinating to look at how they're responding. And I think, I didn't do this in the speech, but we have to put this into context for a moment. You know, imagine being an Edwardian man, that is, having grown up in Edwardian England in this kind of ideal time, even though both Tolkien and Lewis had rather troubled childhoods in all kinds of ways and very complicated childhoods. But they had grown up in this rather, at least a time that they somewhat idolized. And then suddenly you get to the 1920s after World War I, and of course they've experienced World War I, they've experienced the trenches, they know the horrors of World War I. Lewis seems to have accepted World War I a little bit better than Tolkien did. I think Tolkien had a very difficult time throughout much of his life trying to deal with the trauma of World War I. And that comes out, I think, somewhat in The Lord of the Rings in a couple of different passages. But imagine, not only do we have this war to end all wars in World War I, which clearly does not end all wars, but then we see not only the fall of kingdoms, but the rise of fascisms and communisms and all these various ideologies. And the world looked like it was going to hell in the 1920s and in the 1930s. And then, of course, with the division of Poland in 1939 and the outbreak of World War II, all of these things, I think, form a backdrop to how they're thinking about what had gone wrong in Western civilization and elsewhere. And we have to remember, you know, as much as we might, and especially in this room, of course, I'm sure all of us in this room despise fascism and communism, they came out of the Western tradition. They were not antithetical to the West. They came out of the West. Marx was liberally educated. The founders of fascism tended to be liberally educated as well, and they came out of the Western tradition. So much, and this is what Lewis says in that discussion I briefly mentioned between Ransom and Lewis, so much of the problems was brewed in the West, as Lewis puts it in That Hideous Strength, and it then permeates the whole of civilization. And others like Christopher Dawson are trying to make that point as well. But a huge point then, and I think, Emily, this is where you were getting at, a huge advantage that Lewis and Tolkien have, not only knowing all of this, but they're trying to give the West a new life. They're trying to re-energize the West. They're trying, in this form of anamnesis, they're trying to reawaken us to things that had always been true. And so we can look back to Socrates, Plato, to Aristotle, to Cicero, to Cato the Younger, to St. Augustine, to Dante. All of these people in some way have led the way. And I think, at least as I read it in my own work, this is how I see the Inklings. I see them very much as these great bardic defenders of what the Western tradition is. I don't think they're completely limited to the Western tradition. If they were, they wouldn't have employed science fiction as a genre. I think much like what T.S. Eliot was doing, I think they were very willing to take extremely modern forms of poetry and of literature and of art, but imbue those modern forms with very traditional ideals. So to me, that's what gives them so much greatness. But I mean, they're excellent in what they do as well. But I think in their own pattern, they're trying to revive what had been and what could be again. So they are trying to awaken us. Yeah, thank you.
We have time for one more question.
So the idea of looking backwards to something that was better and came before is all over Tolkien. You don't even have to look hard. He knows way too much about the history of his world and constantly brings it up, and it's beautiful, and I love it. Where does that show up in Lewis? Does he pervade that idea throughout his stories as well?
I think Lewis overall, and I think the other speakers this week could probably answer that better than I could, especially that's something that I would ask Father Ward about. But I think that Lewis himself was a little more acclimated to modernity than Tolkien was. Now, Holly Ordway, who will be speaking, and I'm sure she will be excellent, her new book, Tolkien's Modern Reading, is an excellent book. She actually explores his embrace of modernity, especially in terms of its art and literature. But there's no doubt, I think, that when we look at his fiction, especially the fact that Tolkien is always making the older things better than the newer things, right? I mean, with the swords and so forth, which you see in Beowulf too. But you have these old things that have somehow survived into modernity. I think that he's more questioning a lot of that. But I do think that Lewis, especially in his fiction, is a little bit more understanding of the modern and more taken with it. But I would recommend, and it sounds like you probably already dived into all of this, but I would definitely recommend his Space Trilogy, where, again, Lewis is thinking about what modernity is, but he's not necessarily doing anything other than baptizing it. He's criticizing it in large part, but he's criticizing it to a sense where we can make it something good and do something with that. And you see that especially in the third of the Space Trilogy, in that Hideous Strength, where you do bring Merlin back from the past, but Merlin then plays his role, and he more or less fades out in the story. And it's this young couple, they're 23, they're your age, Mark Studdick and Jane Studdick. They're really the ones who are left at the end. In this, I mean, they're left in a very romantic embrace in a cottage where we assume that they are coming together as a married couple to bring about a new King Arthur. So there's still this possibility of all of these great things happening, but they'll happen within the modern era as well. I think Tolkien's a little bit more skeptical about that. But they're both, I mean, they're not crazies, obviously. They're both living within the modern world. They both had done their duty during World War I. They had certainly fought and had done the good thing. They had been patriots in that war. And they certainly lived in the modern world, even though someone like Tolkien was rather skeptical of cars. There's a famous story where, but he was more skeptical of cars because of what it was doing to the architecture and the layout of Oxford. But there is this great story, and I can't remember, I think it was Clyde Kilby. So Kilby was this professor from Wheaton College who went and lived just down the street from Tolkien during the summer of 1966 and was given complete access to Tolkien's papers to try and help him get the Silmarillion. And I think it's from Kilby, where they were talking and a motorcycle roared down the road. And Tolkien lifted up his fist and said, basically, "You orc," right? Right. That's. I mean, I think that fits his attitude on a lot of modern, or at least the abuse of modern technology. So, but I don't want to make them crazy. I think they're just lovably eccentric. So, thank you for that. Yeah, it's good. Well, thank you all very much.